We're gonna go pretty off the cuff here. Honestly, Wind in Truth was a disappointment. And to tell you the truth,
oh, brother, this guy stinks!
I'm not even really a big Sanderson fan. I like the Stormlight archive, okay? Don't get me wrong, I like it. I'm gonna keep reading it as it comes out, and while each book has amazing standout moments, Sanderson is usually a master at writing these endings that pay off everybody's struggles, are emotionally salient. Brandon manages to whiff at what is, to me right now, and I imagine a lot of people, the most critical and pivotal moment in this entire series. I mean, let's talk about, like journey before destination. Because my journey with the Stormlight archive is probably different than a lot of yours. My experience with the Way of Kings was rocky from the start. It was my first time reading Sanderson, and coming from reading authors like Tolkien or George Martin, yeah, I said Martin, I don't like doing the double R, so he's George Martin to me. I found it really difficult to get on board with Sanderson's personal brand of invisible prose. And I promise I'm not going to harp on this a million times. I know everybody harps on Sanderson's prose. I read books for the art of the written word. I like there to be some thoughtful construction to the sentences that I'm reading. And I like little hits of poetry here and there. I'm not asking the guy to be Cormac McCarthy or even Tolkien. I don't know, man. Getting a little closer to Ursula K. Le Guin would elevate this series to some of my favorite high fantasy that I've ever read. That's how much his prose is holding him back, in my opinion, okay? But despite that hurdle, I thought that what Brandon was doing with his unique world and his magic was interesting enough to keep me invested and to keep me reading. I'll be honest, I'm a sucker for a thick book. I love books that you can really sink into and live in and grow attached to characters and the world. And despite not loving the way that Brandon writes, I was still having a good time because the man knows how to write those fist-pumping, chest-pounding, emotionally impactful resolutions. Even if you don't love what the guy does, if you've gotten to the end of one of his books, you know what I'm talking about. He's a great storyteller. Those destinations that he gets to make the journeys, the thick journeys, worth it. And that's why Wind in Truth is so confusing, because this was supposed to be a layup, the grand conclusion to the first arc of the Stormlight archive. This is a book where Brandon's strengths should have shined brighter than any of the other previous installments in this series. And yet, not one of the main perspective characters gets anything resembling a satisfying conclusion. I'm going to assume that you've watched other videos on Wind in Truth, and so I'm going to skip over what I've seen most people complaining about and instead focus on what I found to be the most frustrating aspect of this book. And to put it in the most blunt way, I think we were bait and switched. Hear me out. We are 5 books into a 2-arc, 10-book series. I think everybody that read Rhythm of War will tell you that it was a setup book. Setup books are fine. There was a lot that I loved about Rhythm of War. Navani and Raboniel getting Urithiru up and running. Adolin and Maya in Lasting Integrity. All that stuff is great. But the reason Rhythm of War being a setup book wasn't disappointing was because we always knew it would be. You get what I mean? We weren't expecting a grand conclusion to the plot points that were being developed. We were expecting more development. We knew whatever was getting set up in Rhythm of War would be tackled and resolved in the next book.
Psych! That's the wrong number!
So when we reach Wind in Truth and our main POV characters have already done all the learning and growing that they were going to do, it leaves them with very little to do of any consequence. Let's see. Let's break down what our main characters actually do and how they change in this book. So, Kaladin. Kaladin accompanies Zeth. He learns to be a bad therapist that inexplicably gets good results. And he literally fights his battles with a flute, which honestly, I think is actually pretty cool and would have made sense if he had spent some time developing that skill or showing that he cared about music in any way. If he had just spent some time playing the flute. This could have made sense and been satisfying, but as it stands, it just comes out of nowhere. That's all I'm saying. And I'll admit, it's pretty disappointing that, like, the badass warrior character who, let's be honest, the last 3 books of him being depressed and not being in action are not the most fun Kaladin reading experiences, okay? The most fun it is to be reading Kaladin is during his action and battle sequences. Effectively, he gets no exciting climactic battle. For his whole role in the book, there's nothing that equates to anything that happens in the Way of Kings or Words of Radiance. That's just a fact. We go from watching Cal save Dalinar with Bridge 4 to helping Adolin in a hopeless duel to fighting the Pursuer to musically doing the equivalent of dumping a bucket of cold water on the heralds' heads so that they snap out of their frenzy. Not too satisfying. And when it comes to his development, like when Kaladin gets down to the 5th ideal, it's nothing he didn't already feel and accept at the very beginning of the book. In fact, honestly, it's nothing he didn't feel at the time that he accepted the 4th ideal. There's sort of this intrinsic tie of the 4th and the 5th ideal, because in order to do the 4th, to accept that he's not going to save everybody, he must also care for himself and continue to exist. Nothing Cal does in Wind and Truth contributes to him having to realize that he needs to care for himself, because in the entirety of the story, he is focused on Zeth and the heralds. In fact, when people ask him how he's doing, he's like, hey, I'm doing pretty good. There's nothing for you to do in this book. Why are you in this book? He's effectively no different at the end of the book than he was at the start. And he didn't really do anything but become a herald and then go away. Okay, Shallan. Let's get down to Shallan. Shallan is tracking down Mraize in the spiritual realm with the intention of killing him. And when she finally can, she doesn't. She suddenly sees Mraize as a mentor, though he isn't a mentor in any meaningful way that, like, the Uber app is a mentor in telling the Uber driver to go pick somebody up. That's essentially what Mraize functioned as. She's effectively on, like, a side quest the entire story, and it simply doesn't impact the greater plot, and then it resolves in a non-ending. Not to mention, the entire idea of her integrating these split personalities is emotionally moot if she still communicates with Vale as a fractured, separate personality. Integrating Vale implies that Vale goes away and that the strengths that Vale had that Shallan didn't should have been integrated into Shallan's default Shallan persona. I'm only saying this because I was genuinely confused when she was still talking to Vale. Because in Rhythm of War, Sanderson makes it a pivotal, emotional moment that we're saying goodbye to Vale. Because Shallan no longer needs Vale to shield her from the emotional truths in her memories. I haven't read Rhythm of War in a couple months. Correct me if I'm wrong. She, like, fades away literally, like, goodbye. But I guess not. I guess she's still there to talk to anyway as a separate entity, but just in her head. So it's like nothing really happened. Vale just doesn't take over anymore, but behaves and consults exactly like she always did. So Shallan hasn't grown and changed since Rhythm of War. and she still doesn't grow or effectively do anything in Wind and Truth. She is effectively operating in an in-book novella called Ghost Bloods that does not have anything to do with the main plot of what's happening in these 10 days. And that brings us to Dalinar, my favorite character in this whole series, who is butchered.
Look how they massacred my boy.
Dalinar also literally does nothing in Wind and Truth, and then he dies. Dalinar spends 95% of his time in the spiritual realm watching reruns of Heralds. And until the very last moment, when he's talking with Noadon, does he realize this like big brain move of just saying, nah, screw it, break the contract, we're done. I can at least grant that Dalinar grows by realizing that, like, okay, it's okay for someone else to save the world, the Cosmere. But when you think about the broad strokes of what Dalinar did and what the previous books had been alluding to, this was a massive bait and switch. And there's like no other way of saying it, but it was just a bait and switch. And it's not even a satisfying one. Essentially, this 1,300-page book culminates in a non-event, a proverbial rain check on a cosmic scale, which leaves the story in an interesting place to develop over another 5 books. And it would be perfectly fine if the investment we did to get to this plot point wasn't 1,300 pages. Like, if I was reading the general plot points of where this story ended in Wind and Truth, I think it would be more satisfying than having read the book. And that's because, partly, while Brandon Sanderson is a master of plot and character development, his prose style lacks poetry. I said I wouldn't harp on this, but it's a fact of why the 1,300 pages isn't very enjoyable for where we end in the story. If I'm not going to have satisfying conclusions and development in a story, well, hell, at least I had a great time reading it to get to that non-conclusion. At least there are some real pithy witticisms and creative sentences for me to read and little hits of poetry. I mean, he doesn't have to be William Faulkner, you know what I mean? Or like Cormac McCarthy, like I was talking about earlier, but still, give me a little something. Give me a little something if it's going to be 1,300 pages, nothing. Regardless of not getting a satisfying plot payoff, and honestly, man, it's not just the prose. His dialogue can be outright embarrassing. So if the bulk of the reading isn't stimulating in a poetic way, and the plot resolves in a series of non-events, what is this book? It's filler. It's a filler book. Anyway, I'm reading Mistborn now, and a lot of the complaints I have in this book are not so bad in Mistborn. Feel free to agree with me in the comments.